Successful adaptation includes mitigation. In 2007, I attended a colloquium on the archaeology of Sagalassos. Sagalassos was a city in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Part of the program included a discussion of the archaeology prior to the emergence of the city. The speakers described groups of people in the mountains who moved around in companionship with their goats. About 12,000 years ago, there was a time of very rapid warming, followed by 2,000 years of more persistent warming before the temperature stabilized. Listening to this prehistory, I realized that these people were coping with the end of the Ice Age, the last glacial maximum. As the glaciers retreated and the glacial lakes dried up, people went higher into the mountains. Turkey itself had not been fully glaciated. It was a transition area. It would be a landscape where the climate, the plants, the animals would have great variation. As the climate was warming at the end of the Ice Age, the changes would be very rapid. Areas that were wet and dry, warm and cold would be shifting. As this temperature stabilized, compared to today, there would still be substantial amounts of ice in the mountains of Anatolia. The mountain glaciers would take many years to come into balance with the new temperature and precipitation. For centuries, one generation after another would have experienced the temperature rising and precipitation patterns changing. People were likely experiencing great floods as ice dams burst and released melting glacial water. This water abundance would have been contrasted with a trend towards more drought, which left them chasing water in the mountains. Much the same could be said about what we are experiencing today. Not having the benefit of a science-based understanding, the people at the end of the Ice Age would be relegated to reacting to what was happening. They would develop myth and perhaps seek supernatural explanations. Over a few centuries, sea level rose quickly. Then sea level stabilized. Civilization and commerce emerged and flourished. It was the start of millennia of what would prove to be a relatively stable climate. This 10,000-year span is called the Holocene. During the stable climate of the Holocene, we could be confident that the weather that our grandparents, our elders had experienced would inform us of what to expect, how to build, what to plant, smart ways to behave. We can relate expansions and contractions of cultures, civilizations, and empires to sustained decades of warm and cold and wet and dry. Historically, everyone before us had been reacting to changes in the climate. They counted on the climate being as it had always been. If large changes were coming during their lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren, they were unknowing. We know what is to come in the next century. This knowing is both good fortune and a curse. We know that the changes in our climate will likely exceed those experienced by the people at the end of the last Ice Age. We know that they will be even more rapid. I want to look at the temperature of the last 150 years. This plot shows a year-by-year difference from a 30-year average calculated from 1951 to 1980. It is a global average of air temperature, 2 meters above the surface. In addition to the points from each year, there are averages of each decade, which appear as steps from one decade to the next. Most of the heat which is accumulating in our planet goes into the ocean. Some is stored in the land and some is melting ice. Only the smallest portion ends up in the atmosphere. This accumulation of heat is like heating up a ceramic stove in a winter home. It is storage of heat. This heat assures the Earth's temperature will continue to be warmer than in the past. The effects of the heat, melting ice, increasing sea level, and fueling extremes in water abundance and water scarcity will be with us for decades and centuries. The rise in temperature, which emerged from the noisy background of natural weather and climate variability in the 1980s, is just the beginning. If you examine the 1990s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, the warming is continuing and it is accelerating. Despite the calls, the alarms, and in fact the real progress to mitigate the accumulation of heat and planetary warming, there is no evidence-based reason to conclude that the observed warming will not continue for decades. Sea level, whose stability was important to the emergence of civilization and commerce, will no longer be stable. We can expect several meters of sea level rise over the coming centuries, at least 1 meter in the coming decades. Though the changes to our planet and our inability to intervene effectively are discouraging, frightening, and often depressing, that we know that this is coming places us in a profoundly different place than our ancestors in the hills above what would become Sagalassos. Not only do we know what is coming, but we know why. We are sentient and innovative species, and we know how to adapt. Let's place the temperature graph in the context of humans. February of 1985 was the last month when it was cooler than the 20th century average. As I'm writing this, we are approaching 37 years of above average temperatures. The median age of people on the planet is 31 years. Far more than half the world's population has never experienced a month when Earth was cooler than average. Some have experienced a cold month in their homes now and again, but they are increasingly rare. A conventional and imperfect definition of the climate is a 30-year average of weather. The students I teach feel that the climate is changing so rapidly that a 10-year average might be more appropriate. They tell me that the climate I experienced as a child is no longer relevant. Think about how we build our buildings, our bridges, our ports, our airports, our cities. We plan and build on spans of times that might be tens of years or decades. Some of us imagine that what we build will survive and be relevant for centuries, if not forever. In the time it takes for planning, design, and permitting, the climate will have changed. Over the existence of the things that we build, the climate will be changing. The landscape, the plants, the animals will be changing around us and around what we build. The climate into which we deposit our legacies will be different from the one in which we sought to build them. Normal means average. There will be no new normal in the sense of an unchanging average. We will be defining and redefining our relation to the weather. We will be renormalizing. This past year in my class, we considered the small town Avon on one of the barrier islands of North Carolina, the Outer Banks, they're called. These islands are shifting sand, often no more than 2 meters above sea level. Their dunes are weakly anchored by grasses and scrubby trees. As sea level rises, the storm surge from hurricanes and winter storms overwhelms the houses. The storms wash through the islands. They disconnect bridges from land. High tides flood the waterfront of towns perhaps 90 days a year. Nuisance flooding, it is called. My students were conditioned with all that I teach. Still, their first response is to protect and persist, react to damage, build back better, become more resilient, lift houses onto stilts, armor the coast with concrete and rocks, incorporate the more sustainable practices of green infrastructure to absorb storm surge. This reaction is looking to the past, take the punches and coming back stronger. This reaction tries to preserve the past. How long might this be viable on a sand island at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean? Maybe 30 years? There are thousands of miles of coastland for which this past-preserving reaction, protect and persist, will prove impossible. There are inland cities where increasing rain is overwhelming storm drains. There are vast areas where drought is contributing to wildfires, unsustainable farms, and unmanageable conservation zones. We need to move past a psychology of past preserving into a behavior of future building. Managed change is difficult for the human collective. We like to find something that works for us and stick with it. We do what we know how to do. Whenever we are confronted with the need for change, there is an ever-present tension looking back to the past at what worked or looking forward in ways that are fundamentally different. Though the past has many lessons, both good and bad, to teach us, what we face with climate change will require us to rethink the way we live with weather and interact with Earth's air, land, and water. We cannot rely on protect and persist. The framing of climate change as something external to us that can be fixed and forgotten will not be the formula for success. Adaptation must take on a more central role than it has in the past. We need to be thinking of where incremental changes to our built system, for example, storm drains, make sense. We need to be developing policy and standards that do not assume an unchanging climate. We need to be developing better land use plans and integrate in green infrastructure. We need to be thinking about fluxes of migrating people. In some cases, these things will work, but in many cases, they will only be buying time. We need to be deciding when our old reactive ways are no longer adequate. We need to envision new, adaptive approaches to building and engineering, one in which the climate, the environment, is changing. What we have built in the past, road systems, global supply chains, centralized energy and agriculture, may not be the right way to build the future. We need to think of changes in terms of systems, making our built environment a fluid part of the Earth's nature. How does it all fit together? As we adapt, we have an important decision to make. How do we achieve reduction of greenhouse gases at sufficient scale to keep it from getting too warm too fast? How do we adapt such that mitigation is simply part of what we do? How do we avoid placing Earth on the unsustainable infrastructure of a geoengineered life support? The United Nations reports tell us that we have these coming 30 years to reduce our emissions by vast amounts to avoid a 1.5 or 2 degree average warming. If we do not limit warming, then our ability to adapt as a civil society becomes more and more difficult. If you think about the next century, our climate future is what we know best. That should be empowering. We cannot thrive if we frame our day-to-day lives as persistent crises. As the climate changes, we will need to normalize and renormalize. This behavior will be essential to well-being. The climate will be warming over one's lifetime, ice will be melting, and sea level will be rising. The seasonal rhythm of water will change. There will be loss and there will be opportunity. We must adapt to these changes psychologically and behaviorally as well as practically. Our future is not only in our hands, it is also our responsibility to shape that future. Not only in how warm it will get, but how does what we build fit together and allow us to thrive. At the center of a successful relationship with our changing climate will be design, architecture, and engineering. We express ourselves individually and collectively in what we build and what we don't build. We will need to adapt in such a way that mitigation is a natural outcome.